In 1979, a 12-year-old boy interrupted a botany lesson with a single sentence. "That plant grows near my house." It simply couldn't be true. But when botanists examined the branch, they confirmed the impossible. It was the last wild Cafe Marron bush on Earth. For more than a century, it had been growing beside a road that thousands of people passed every day. And the moment people learned of the discovery, the last bush found itself in even greater danger. Mauritius had to attempt something no one had ever tried before. The boy's name was Hedley Mannon. The teacher who had handed out the illustrations that day was named Raymond. The boy's name rarely appears in the scientific literature on Cafe Marron. He is usually referred to simply as the Schoolboy, as if the detail carried no weight in the botanical story. But he was the only person on the entire island who that day recognized the plant in an 1877 drawing. A 12-year-old child who had walked past that bush on his way home every day and never imagined he was looking at anything special. The plant is called Ramosmania rodriguezi, endemic to the island of Rodriguez in the Indian Ocean, a tiny sliver of land thousands of kilometers from the nearest mainland. Slightly over a meter tall, with white flowers. A relative of the coffee tree, locals believed a decoction of its bark cured hangovers and venereal diseases, hence the name Cafe Marron, literally brown coffee. That belief destroyed the species. The bushes were cut for decoctions for decades until not a single wild specimen remained, except one that simply nobody had recognized. In 1985, the Species Survival Commission of the International Union for Conservation of Nature added Cafe Marron to its list of the planet's 24 most endangered species. At that point, based on the single known specimen, the one still growing behind a fence by the roadside. The following year, the press was writing about it as the world's rarest tree. This was no longer a local story from a small island. The plant had entered the international conservation community's field of view before anyone knew whether it could be saved at all. And there lay the paradox. The plant wasn't killed by poaching immediately after its discovery. It was nearly killed by the act of saving it. The moment a fence was built around a few branches, locals understood this was a special plant, which meant it cured things better than anything else. People climbed over the fence, snapping off bark and twigs. A barbed wire fence went up. People got around that too. A second fence had to be built around the first. The protection was creating its own demand. The solution turned out to be not one person, but a chain of people, each passing a tiny fragment of the plant further along. Botanist Wendy Strom took 2 cuttings from the bush and personally carried them to the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew in London, over 9,000 kilometers away. They were received by Kew specialist Margaret Ramsay. The cuttings took. A clone of the original bush appeared, genetically the same plant, simply now in a London greenhouse. It flowered regularly, year after year, for 20 years in a row, and produced no seed. The reason wasn't immediately obvious. Young Ramosmania leaves are darker and narrower than adult ones, so much so that for years botanists couldn't confidently identify young specimens of the species even when they encountered them. Researchers put forward a hypothesis. This difference was an evolutionary defense against giant tortoises that used to browse the low young shoots. The darker color made the young bush less conspicuous. Nature had camouflaged the species so effectively that it had nearly caused its own extinction. People simply failed to recognize it when they came across it. But the adult plant in Kew had a different problem. Its flowers turned out to be functionally male. Pollen was present. Seed-bearing ovaries capable of developing into fruit were not. Magdalena himself, at the time he took on Cafe Marron, was not a typical Kew scientist. He grew up in northern Spain, the son of a florist, during years when the Francoist regime was felling old forests and destroying unproductive wild nature, circumstances that, by his own account, shaped his interest in preserving rare species. In England, he earned Kew's horticultural diploma, an institution he himself called the Oxford of Horticulture, while working in parallel as an ordinary plant propagator. Cafe Marron became the first major challenge of his career. The project on which he developed an approach he would later apply to dozens of other species on the edge of extinction. Do not rely on standard protocol, but study the specific biology of the specific plant until you find the weak point in its protective mechanism. In the late 1980s, Douglas Adams came to Rodriguez, searching for a nearly extinct island bat for a book about vanishing species. Local guides took him first to the bush behind the barbed wire fence, the wild one still growing in its place by the roadside. By that point, the bush's story had been running for 10 years, and the fence around it had been rebuilt 3 times, one layer of barbed wire inside another. The more the plant was protected, the more obvious it became to those who believed in its healing power, and the more frequently someone climbed over the fence for another piece of bark. In London, meanwhile, the clone flowered year after year and produced no seed. The reason turned out to be deeper than simply male flower morphology. Cafe Marron carries an innate self-incompatibility mechanism. Even if pollen and female tissue appear on the same plant, the plant recognizes its own genetic material and rejects it. This is an evolutionary defense against inbreeding, useful when a population has many individuals, and lethal when only one remains. Kew botanists tried standard pollination methods for 20 years. None worked, because all the clones in the greenhouse were genetically identical. Pollen from one plant remained its own pollen for any other. In 2003, a new horticulturalist joined Kew and took on a plant his colleagues had spent 2 decades treating as a dead end. His first method, amputating the stigma of a flower and applying pollen directly to the wound, an attempt to bypass the rejection mechanism through physical damage to the tissue. It did not work. Then Magdalena turned his attention to a detail that hadn't been studied systematically before. Cafe Marron is a protandrous species, meaning the male phase matures first in each flower, with the female phase possible only later, with a delay. In nature, this prevents self-pollination within a single flower. In the greenhouse, where the plant flowered in stable conditions without seasonal variation, this second phase may simply never have arrived. Magdalena moved several cloned plants closer to a heater, recreating a sharper temperature fluctuation closer to what occurred in nature. Toward the end of the flowering cycle, some plants produced flowers of a different morphology with an elongated pistil, functionally female. He began hand-pollinating them with pollen from other clones, repeating the procedure each time such a flower appeared. He did this nearly 300 times over several seasons, recording each attempt because he had no way of knowing in advance which combination of conditions and pollen donors would finally work. The first fruit set. From them came viable seed, for the first time in the entire documented history of the species in cultivation. 24 years had passed since the day a 12-year-old boy raised his hand in a classroom on Rodriguez. And in that same year of 2003, something happened that nobody had planned and nobody could fully explain. The wild bush on the island, the one behind 3 layers of barbed wire, set fruit for the first time in decades, on its own, without human intervention. There is a term in the scientific literature for species in Cafe Marron's situation: the living dead. The term biologists use for organisms that technically still exist but are doomed to vanish without human intervention, having lost the ability to reproduce on their own. Magdalena used this term in the title of his 2010 paper, Raising the Living Dead. Cafe Marron had for years matched this definition literally: alive, flowering, and simultaneously functionally extinct, because not one of its flowers could produce seed. Even after the first successful pollinations, the work didn't end in the greenhouse. Cafe Marron fruits ripen with seeds packed tightly into the center of the flesh. To extract them without damage, the outer layers were removed one by one, and the seeds themselves separated with tweezers while still fresh and moist. Once they dried, they stuck together, making it nearly impossible to separate them for sowing. Each seed obtained after 300 pollination attempts went through yet another stage where it could be lost to a single careless moment. Getting the first seed turned out to be only half the work. The other half was returning the plant to the island it had disappeared from, and that meant overcoming not biology, but bureaucracy. Cafe Marron seed returned to Rodriguez in 2 separate batches, in 2007 and 2010, each time requiring sign-off from local authorities, quarantine checks, and coordination with the island's conservation organization. The process was so fragile that the fate of several years of work could hinge on a single bag. By Magdalena's own account, he was once promised 5 ready seeds for shipping, and when he came back to collect them, only 3 remained in the packet. A nursery worker had bitten and spat out the shells of the other 2, not knowing what he held in his hands. For a species that had gone 24 years without producing a single seed on its own, the difference between 3 and 5 seeds was felt. Colleagues at Kew described Magdalena's approach as unconventional even by the Botanic Garden standards. Kew's director of horticulture, Richard Barley, said of him simply, "Carlos can achieve things with plants that nobody else can." And Kew scientist Alex Monroe, summarizing the Cafe Marron story for colleagues, used an even shorter phrase, "Carlos delivers." From the first fruits at Kew, seedlings germinated, and among them were both male and female plants. This opened the way to natural rather than manual pollination in subsequent generations. The reintroduction had another advantage that nature itself had taken care of in advance. Cafe Marron is pollinated by nocturnal moths and its seeds dispersed by Rodriguez flying foxes. Both species still live on the island and are in considerably better condition than the plant itself. This meant that when young bushes were finally planted back into Grande Montagne, there was no need to restore the pollination ecosystem from scratch. Cafe Marron's natural reproductive partners had gone nowhere in all that time. As of 2010, the Kew team had grown over 1,000 Ramosmania rodriguezi seeds. Half were sent back to Rodriguez. 300 seedlings were germinated there, on the island where at the start of the 1980s, botanists had counted exactly 1 living specimen of the species on the entire planet. Some of the young bushes were planted in Grande Montagne, the national park on Rodriguez. The species that was officially classified as critically endangered in 1998 began growing on the island for the first time in over a century without a fence around every shoot. There is one more detail that changes the whole story's meaning. Young Cafe Marron bushes now grow in the Grande Montagne Nature Reserve on Rodriguez, and in that same forest, from 2006 to 2007, live Aldabra giant tortoises, brought in specifically as an ecological replacement for the Rodriguez tortoise that vanished from the island in the 18th century. This is precisely the type of animal whose centuries-old habit of browsing low young shoots, according to the botanist's hypothesis, is what drove Cafe Marron to evolve darker leaves at the juvenile stage as camouflage. The plant whose protection proved so effective that people themselves failed to recognize it for centuries is now being planted where the animals that protection originally evolved against are once again walking. Only this time, the tortoises are there not through nature's accident, but through the deliberate decision of the same conservationists who brought Cafe Marron back to life. All the plants grown at Kew before 2003 are clones of a single bush. One genetic line for the entire species for 24 years. Even the first seed obtained through artificial pollination comes from an extremely narrow genetic base. And there remains a question to which Kew still has no answer. Why in 2003, the very same season that Magdalena finally achieved fruit through artificial means, did the wild bush on Rodriguez, the one that for over 20 years had produced no seed on its own, suddenly set fruit by itself without any intervention? A coincidence of conditions? The age of the plant? Nobody in the scientific literature has given a definitive answer. And one more thing rarely mentioned outside a narrow circle of botanists. Ramosmania is a genus of 2 species, and only one was saved. The second, Ramosmania heterophylla, also came down to a single known specimen at Kew, also flowers prolifically, and has still produced no seed. This plant has viable pollen, fully developed embryo sacs, everything appears ready for pollination. The problem lies elsewhere. The flower stigmas are non-functional because the pistil styles are too short, and none of the techniques that worked for Cafe Marron have worked here. The most likely explanation is that the last known specimen of this species is an exclusively male plant, with no possibility of sexual reproduction until a second, undiscovered bush is found somewhere. One species of the genus was pulled out of the living dead category. The other remains there. The last confirmed record of a wild bush on Rodriguez in nature is 1989. After that, no one reported it again. Under current classification, Cafe Marron today carries the status extinct in the wild. The species exists solely thanks to plants grown by people from those first cuttings that Wendy Strom carried to London in 1979. Restoration began in 1996, when a forest recovery project was launched in the Grande Montagne Reserve on Rodrigues, exactly where Cafe Marron would later be returned. Cross-pollination between different clones, which became possible after 2003, produced something that hadn't existed for a single day between 1979 and 2003, genuine genetic diversity rather than copies of one bush. This removed the greatest risk that had accompanied the species for 24 years, that one disease, one pest, or one accident could erase Cafe Marron permanently. Today, reproduction no longer depends on seed alone. In parallel, the Q team uses micropropagation in vitro, small tissue fragments grown in a sterile medium, bypassing the pollination stage entirely. This protects the project against a repeat of the 2007 situation, where the fate of an entire batch hinged on whether someone at the nursery would bite into a ripe fruit. As of 2024, over 249,000 plants of native species have been planted in Grande Montagne in total, Cafe Marron just one among them, alongside the Rodrigues warbler and other island endemics. In 2024 alone, nearly 18,000 seedlings of 31 species were added, with survival rates reaching 90% for some, a figure unthinkable for an island that has lost over 98% of its original forest cover. The next goal for the restoration team is to have wild nocturnal moths and Rodrigues flying foxes maintain the reproductive cycle on their own, without the involvement of Q horticulturalists. As happened before the island lost nearly all its vegetation, the bush the 12-year-old boy saw no longer grows alone by a roadside, but the road where it stood is no longer the only place on the planet where this species grows.